Thank you very much. We're going to show you data for the University Park campus, the Hershey Medical campus, and, as Mark said, the 10 Commonwealth campuses. This is our latest data set. Just a little bit about Sightlines. We are, as Ford said, a nationwide company. Penn State was one of the first 10 campuses to start working with us back in 2003. We now have 450 campuses that work with us across the United States. We have data on over 1 billion square feet of space. Most of the Big Ten, 12 of the 14 Big Ten campuses work with us, 32 flagship campuses across the country, and as you can see over on the right-hand side, state systems across the country work with us, as well as university systems, including the PSU system, and we use many of those as benchmarks for the different campuses that we'll be looking at. Just a quick review of our vocabulary. We have created a common vocabulary for measuring the return on the physical assets that you have. That common vocabulary falls into 4 areas. We collect about 200 different metrics in these 4 areas. One deals with the concept of annual stewardship, which is what is the annual cost of keeping up? That is, making sure your buildings perform properly and reach their useful life. And so we'll look at that for all of the campuses. Secondly, if you can't keep up, you can always catch up, and that is your backlog of deferred maintenance and the resources that you have to address that backlog. And asset reinvestment, which is really a critical concept here, is important to look at from the standpoint of is your backlog growing? Are you spending enough to make sure that you're not only keeping up with the existing buildings and replacing those components as they come due, but are you catching up with the backlog of deferred maintenance? We'll measure that on all your campuses. Then we do a lot of measuring of the operational effectiveness of campuses. We look at a range of metrics there: staffing, supervision, budgets, energy management, work order management. All of those processes are analyzed and assessed and rated and evaluated. And then finally, we measure the quality of the service that's being provided, how the campus customers feel about the facilities operations, how they feel about the facilities themselves, as well as our own analysis as we walk through that rates things like cleanliness, appearance, repair, mechanical spaces, etc. What's included in this analysis? In this analysis, we have a little bit over, I think around almost 20 million square feet. Remember, we're doing just 10 of the Commonwealth campuses. We'll do the other 10 this fall. But you can see the breakdown of not only the percentage of the square footage among that 20 million square feet, but also the value. The replacement value here is about $7.5 billion. So when you think about the board's responsibility to steward the assets, and just the campuses that we've done so far, which of course is the majority of space, over $7 billion is what you're stewarding and what you're responsible to make sure that you're keeping up and dealing with over time. And you can see how that breaks down: a little bit over 12 million at University Park, almost 4 million at Hershey, and then the 10 Commonwealth campuses, about another little bit over 3 million square feet for them. We will add the other 10 smaller campuses this year, so we'll have data on all 20. We have different peer groups for these different types of institutions because they look very different. The peer group for UP is primarily the Big Ten campuses. The peer group for the medical center is other medical centers, and you could see some of the bigger medical centers across the country that we benchmark for Hershey Medical Center. And then the Commonwealth campuses, we benchmark them against other state systems that we have in places like Connecticut and Pennsylvania and different parts of the country, but we take out the larger flagship campuses out of that analysis. So we've got kind of a good analysis of apples and apples. So typically this is the smaller regional campuses that we see in Massachusetts or Maine or the PSU campuses that are a little smaller. So we're not comparing them to big flagship campuses. We think that's a good apples to apples comparison. So let's talk about University Park. This is an analysis, our entire database of 1.3 billion square feet, and when the buildings were built, when they were constructed. And you could see that there are 2 major waves of construction. One that took place between about 1960 and 1975, I mean 55 to 75, in which on our database, over 50% of the space in the entire United States was built during that time on college campuses. The big wave of building post-war, baby boomers, NSF grants. A lot of this campus was built during that time. But then there's been a second wave that has occurred from about 1995 to about 2009. It's kind of tapered off a little bit on most campuses when the recession hit in 2008-9. But that second wave is kind of newer space, more technically complex space. And you can see as you go through those, the earlier space, very well built, you know, the quality construction, but right now in need of programmatic update. That space in the middle, sometimes not such good construction. The quality wasn't good. It was done quickly. It was trying to be done fairly cheaply. And so many of those buildings are needing renewal, needing refreshment. And if they haven't been renovated and the clock hasn't been reset on the building components, all of the buildings built between 1960 and 1975 will turn 50 years old in this decade. So you've got a lot of space in that then. And then there's a third wave, which is higher quality construction, but interestingly enough, more technically complex, like your Millennial Science Center, more technically complex and expensive to maintain. And so campuses are facing these waves of construction. This is UP mapped against that. And as you can see, there was a big wave of construction going back in the 30s and 40s for UP. That's the iconic buildings here on the campus, but also needing a program refreshment. You had that spike, but just a little bit earlier than other people did in the 50s and 60s, and then you've had another big spike in the last 10 years. So this is what the challenge is when you look at construction age. When we look at the campus on what we call renovation age, that is, when the campus was, if buildings are renovated, more than 50% of the replacement value is in a project, and the major building components such as the HVAC systems and the other mechanical systems are refreshed in the building, we reset the clock. So a 1970 building that had a gut renovation and was refreshed would in fact be now a current building, I mean, 2010 or 2012 building, something like that. You can see how UP distributes against the other campuses, particularly the other Big Ten campuses. You have more younger space. That wave that you've had in the last 10 years is higher than them. But you have about the same when you take a look at the space over 25 years old, which is the time where you're really facing some risks and you have to go through renovation cycles and replace building components and update building components. You have exactly the same as the other Big Ten campuses, about 68%. So this is the cards you're dealt. This is what you're faced in terms of dealing with this. One good thing about your distribution is it's not concentrated in any one era. So as things come due, if you've got enough financial resources, you're able to address the building components as they come due. Technical complexity is another thing we measure. That is, how technically complex are your buildings? We measure this on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most technically complex buildings. A lot of outside air movement, complicated technical systems, fume hoods, wet labs, things that really have to maintain. And if you take a look, the buildings that were built in those first two eras were about the same level of technical complexity, but look at how much this has jumped when you look at the buildings built in the last 10, 15 years. Things are really getting much more technically complex, which means that UP really needs sophisticated staff to be able to maintain those buildings, and those systems are very costly. They can be costly to replace. And when we benchmark UP against the other Big Ten campuses, you can see that you're one of the highest in terms of technical complexity, and that has been increasing significantly over the last few years as this new construction's gone up. Millennial Science Center is a 5 on our scale, just to give you a sense of the kind of technical complexity of a building. Another measure we look at is building intensity. This is the number of buildings it takes to make up 1 million square feet. And so when you come onto UP campus, you see the stadium, you see Millennial Science, you kind of get a sense there's a lot of big buildings here. But when you get around to the periphery of the campus, there are a lot of small buildings. And in fact, if you take a look, UP has the second highest building intensity. That is, it takes about 40 buildings to make up 1 million square feet. There's only one campus of the Big Ten that has more buildings to make up 100,000 or 1 million square feet than UP. So you have a lot, while you have got these huge buildings and technically complex buildings, you also have a lot of science buildings. Many of these are in your ag programs and other parts of campus, but you've got that challenge where not only you have to deal with big buildings, but you have to deal with a lot of small buildings that have individual roofs, individual heating systems, and you've got to move your staff around to those buildings to address those needs. Programmatic space is another thing we look at. Interestingly enough, UP has less space per student than peers. When we measure this and look at just academic space, UP has more students in a smaller space than most of the other Big Ten. You can see that you're kind of in the middle, but you're below the peers. So you've got less space, and so one area that as you begin to look at and begin to add, as you add space, it's usually in the programmatic areas to try to relieve some overcrowding. One of the measures we look at is the spending against a target. We create a target based on all of our database, looking at the age of buildings, the complexity of buildings, the backlog in the buildings, and try to come up with a target for UP as to what's going to happen over time and how much should you be spending in order to make sure that you're addressing not only the keep-up needs, but the catch-up needs. That is, if you hit this line, you're spending enough money to be able to not only keep up all the existing buildings, but also buy down that backlog. And you can see that you've been close to that line over a number of years. You've hit it a couple of times, but by and large, you've been adding to your backlog. In the early years of our analysis, there was a lot more adding to the backlog. That gap between the total spending and the line would add to the backlog. In later years, you've kind of done a little bit better. As we move out and project based on your capital plan, there's going to be a couple of very good years where you're going to be able to hit that target, but there's also some other years where you're going to be short of that target. So this suggests to us that over time, just based on financial modeling, that you'll be adding to your backlog, not dramatically, but modestly adding to the backlog. So you're not necessarily gaining ground, you're losing ground, but not dramatically. And as we look at the backlog numbers that was done by another company, we've picked up all those numbers and built them into our analysis, you could see how that backlog is modestly drifting up over a period of time. It started back around up here, a little bit under $1 billion, and it's kind of now drifting up over the years, each year adding a little bit, but been fairly stable over the last few years. Our projection for the future, the red bars means that it's going to be going up, the blue bars means it's going down. It will go up a little bit, but again, fairly modest in terms of the kind of spending patterns that you have. You still are going to be adding to that backlog, not completely catching up, but beginning to have some, kind of keeping this fairly stable area. When we benchmark UP against the other Big Ten campuses, you can see you have about the fourth highest backlog. I do want to caution, as Ford has told me a couple of times, to make sure I caution you that UP does a remarkably good job at being able to track backlog. They look at this every year. They make sure that these numbers are accurate and up to date, and some of the other campuses may not be as up to date. And so when we benchmark this, some of this may just be you do a better job at documenting the backlog, and other people are not doing that. But the backlog is running around $120 a square foot. You can see that that is in an area that's a little bit higher than campuses we have across the country. Majority campuses are just under $100 a square foot. So there's some work to be done on the backlog. You can't just sit back and wait for it to be fixed. It's not going to have to provide some regular investment to make sure that and this is all that big spike. Really what's happening is this is that 50s and 60s spike of construction that's all coming due now at the same time, and that's why your backlog is where it is. It's not because of poor management or bad project selection. It's just a lot of square footage there for you to deal with. On the operations side, the thing to look at is on the left-hand side is kind of the thermometer. Green's good, red's bad. We look at lots of different measures here. The maintenance operation in our determination gives you very high value. One of the things I'll point out is that the PM stands for planned maintenance, planned and preventive maintenance, and UP is one of the highest investors in planned and preventive maintenance. You do more, about 70 cents a square foot puts you in the top 10% of our database across the country in terms of spending on planned and preventive maintenance, and you're really doing much better than a lot of the Big Ten campuses. So that's been really positive. It's one of the reasons why the campus doesn't fall into disrepair, is that the operations are very strong. We look at custodial, again, a very high rating, not only in terms of the inputs, staffing, and supervision and materials, but also the outputs. That last line is our evaluation on a scale of 1 to 5 of the quality of the service and how clean the buildings are. And then also grounds falls into that red zone. So across the board, as Mark pointed out, operations are very strong here. We don't have to give you a lot of recommendations about how to do it better. And in fact, we even have, from time to time, sent people to UP from other campuses for them to learn from you as to how your staff is doing this work. Last piece on UP is the energy costs. Energy costs are important as you've built a lot of square footage in the last 10 years. They're technically complex buildings. You can see we had a spike a few years ago when some new buildings came online, but in general, the trend is downward here over the last few years in terms of total energy costs. Some of that has also come from converting to natural gas and other types of strategies that have been put in place, but very effective energy strategies in place. So you can see as we go through some of the recommendations around the age profile and importance for you to be able to deal with the age profile, the importance of you being able to have a good annual stewardship approach to deal with your small buildings, to be able to have continue to keep up your backlog studies and be able to predict future life cycles. Operations are very strong, need to continue to be strong on a campus this size and this complicated, and energy has been a really remarkably good area, and that needs to continue to work in the future. So that's the summary of UP. I'm going to stop with UP and see if there are any questions, and then we'll go to the Hershey and the Commonwealth campuses, which are a little shorter presentations than this.
When you look at comparing us to our peer institutions for the maintenance and the operational FTEs and all, it would seem to me that did you factor in the fact that we have all those smaller buildings? Yeah, this slide here, operational snapshot. I mean, we seem to be doing really, really well there. Given the number of small buildings, that would mean, unless you're factoring that in, we must be doing incredibly well.
Yeah, and that is one of the challenges because the small buildings, there's travel time to move to those buildings, particularly for your custodial staff and your maintenance staff. They have more roofs, they have more exteriors, they have, they're a lot harder to maintain. So I think that is a good insight and very accurate that you have a particular challenge, and it's very interesting to see that often on campuses where we have a lot of small buildings, they're not very technically complex. But you've got both. You've got big technically complex buildings and small, not very complex buildings, but a lot of them. And a lot of them, frankly, we've done, I think last time, Mark, when we did the analysis for the committee, I think we showed that many of those smaller buildings also are over 50 years old.
I'm in the forecasting business, so I'm always looking ahead. So I think the whole learning, teaching process is probably going to change more dramatically in the next 10 years than it has in the last 50. Do you make recommendations and look at our space from the standpoint of what's going to be needed, as best you can see some of the kinds of changes that are occurring so that we spend the money on maintenance most efficiently and effectively as we look back at it from 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we try to do. That's why we measured that program space per student. It's a little lower here. The question is, are you kind of right-sizing and anticipating the future where maybe students will take courses online or not necessarily have to attend a class, maybe do it from online from their dorm room or something like that, or in fact are you falling behind on program space? So we continue to analyze that, monitor it as we go out. That also is one of the questions about the smaller buildings. Will these smaller buildings continue to be needed? Are they, in many campuses, people are looking at some of the small buildings to eliminate those, demolish them, replace them with other buildings that are more functional for program space in the future.
And the buildings themselves, I assume, is what kind of technical capabilities are needed.
Absolutely, and the functionality of buildings. That's one of the things that we're having difficulty with is predicting what classrooms are going to look like. They've changed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. What are they going to look like in the future again? And how do you make sure that when you build a new building, it's flexible enough that you can adjust and you're not just locked into space?
Yeah. Thanks.
Good. I'm going to move on to the Hershey Medical Campus. Hershey Medical Campus, as we said to you earlier, is just about 4 million square feet. Hershey Medical Campus is a pretty young campus when we look at it right now. You could see the percentage of space, even compared to other medical campuses, over the majority of their space, or just about 50-50 of their space, is under 25 years old. So they've got a big bulk of space in that 25 to 50, the yellow space. So they've got some threats here in the future, but right now they're in pretty good shape. What's interesting is if you look at them over time, this is Hershey now, and if there was no money invested in Hershey, and we know you won't do that, we know you're going to be continue to put resources into Hershey, but if there was not investment in Hershey, that's what Hershey Medical would look like in 5 years. And this is what Hershey Medical would look like in 10 years. So where now they're in a very, very favorable position, lots of new space, lots of young space. That space, the 10 to 25-year-old space, is in its 20 to 25-year-old time frame. And the 40 to 50-year-old, or the 25 to 50-year-old space is in about the 45 to 50. So all of these buildings are going to convert over to another age category in the next few years. And so the watchword on Hershey is plan ahead. You know, we've got a favorable position right now, but it could change very rapidly if there's not enough investment in the medical center. The medical center is on the edge of aging significantly and could, in fact, have the vast majority of its space over 25 years old, even in just 5 years. Technical complexity, just compare that. You can see UP is at 3.5. Medical center is over 4, so medical center buildings are very technically complex and complicated to maintain and expensive to maintain, expensive to provide electrical and heating to them. But Hershey's about the same as other medical campuses that we benchmark. So it's very, the systems there are very similar to what we see in other medical centers across the country. This is the spending target for Hershey. As you can see, they've only met, just started with Hershey, so we've only done 5 years of analysis. You can see they've only met that target 1 of those 5 years. They have heavy reliance on the yellow, which is our asset reinvestment or one-time capital to deal with the catch-up, not so much in terms of the blue. That's an area that I think they can grow, particularly as they have younger buildings, do more planned maintenance, do more annual investment in those buildings. When we look at the backlog trend, since they're not meeting their targets, you could see that the backlog actually came down in that when they had a really robust year a few years ago, but it's drifted up over the last 3 or 4 years. Yet they're still in a more favorable position, only about $80 a square foot compared to their peers. And so the medical center overall has a relatively low backlog, is a young campus, but will change quite rapidly over the next 5 to 10 years. And so the next decade is a challenge for planning to be able to make sure that we don't let that medical center decline in terms of its overall quality of space. From an operational standpoint, we just look at maintenance and grounds for them. The custodial operation is not part of the central facilities there. It's a different completely operation. Custodial grounds or maintenance and grounds are in the green area, not quite as high as we see at UP, but doing pretty well. On the maintenance side, grounds are very nice there and have been, the work is as exceptional from what we can see, and our evaluation is that you're getting high value in both areas, but particularly in the grounds area. Energy is always a challenge at medical centers because consume a lot of energy. If I were to put this against your Commonwealth campuses or even against UP, medical centers just consume a lot of energy because of the nature of the buildings and the traffic that's in those buildings. Hershey's doing pretty well against other campuses. They fall below the average of the peer campuses, and they've been pretty steady over the last few years. And so energy has been a pretty good highlight for the campus so far. So overall, just quick on energy, on Hershey, the campus is young, but will change significantly over time. We think it's important to implement an annual stewardship strategy, that keep-up investment strategy like we see at UP, to have that in place at Hershey, to try to protect that younger space, extend those life cycles, make sure that the buildings are going to function properly. Particularly, there's a high risk in a medical center if buildings fail and building components fail because you've got patient care at risk. We need to kind of prepare over the next few years to understand what's going to come due. We are going to be implementing a model there to predict life cycle needs for them over the next 10 years and help them plan ahead and not get into a situation where those buildings will continue to age and they will fall behind and that backlog will continue to grow. And while it's more complex, it is consuming less energy and doing a very good job on that overall. Questions about the Hershey Medical Center?
Do you play the same role at Hershey as you do here?
You will see.
No, they have a separate person, Mark Smith, down here that's responsible for their facilities, and Mark works with a guy named Wayne Zolko, who's David Gray's.
Okay. And I assume they have all this information?
They do, yeah. Mark has, we've reviewed this with them, and they actually provided all that data. So
It occurs to me though, Mark, it'd probably be worthwhile getting this in front of the board.
Yeah, that'd be good, yeah.
Any other questions on Hershey?
I have one question.
Yep.
The youthfulness of the Hershey campus, it may be beyond the scope of your study, but do you have any information on how that will benefit us if we keep up the maintenance in terms of operational efficiency compared to peers and also to competitiveness
Yeah,
going forward?
absolutely. For us, when we look at age profile and we look at spending, it's about risk. It's about managing risk. We want to make sure that we're managing risk properly. As buildings age, the risk goes up. As I pointed out, I think on this slide. The older buildings get, the higher risk you have, the risk of building failure. Particularly with the medical setting, if there's a building failure, if the HVAC system was to fail, if the electrical system was to fail, that really puts patients at risk. You know, it's not like a college campus where you might be able to adjust and work around that academic building. And so it's really, really important for medical centers to make sure that they're continuing looking at risk and reducing risk. And what's happening with this age profile is that that risk factor is just going to be going up dramatically over the next 10 years. So for us, it's about figuring out ways to manage that risk. There maybe not going to be enough money to do everything. So the question is, what priorities do you set to make sure that you minimize the risk factors that are coming forward here? Because we just know the buildings are on the edge of going to a different level in terms of that risk because of their aging.
Complexity would add to this.
Complexity adds very much to it, and it adds to the expense of the particular project, because when you're so complex, replacing a building system, it's not a simple replacement of a boiler or a small air handler. In fact, these are complicated systems and very expensive to do.
And you have more systems to monitor,
Absolutely.
which adds to the dimension of risk.
Exactly. So that's part of what we'll be doing over the next few years with Hershey, is applying a model, a life cycle model that helps them predict when those building components are going to come due over the next 10 years, what they need to do first, and how they can sequence in the funding so that they minimize that risk.
It begs the question whether or not complexity adds to, well, as these buildings become more complex, you're at a risk if that is the measure that comes along with
Right.
complexity.
You're adding risk. On the other hand, complex buildings can support complex programs, and complex buildings often have a high level of efficiency if the systems run properly. They consume less energy overall. They, are easier to maintain if you, in fact, are paying attention to them. They run very, very effectively. But as you say, as you point out, as they age, replacing those systems is going to be expensive.
Hey, Ford, did you give us an analysis, Barbara, just remind me, did you do an analysis for us as to the cost of waiting to catch up with the backlog?
It costs more the longer you wait, so
Right, Jim's got,
I was getting to that.
yeah,
Okay.
it's about, in his funding charts, the darker blue line at the bottom, and then the
Yeah.
catch-up yellow line. There's a balance between how much money you want to spend to kind of keep the buildings up versus catching up. But usually, it's kind of a rule of thumb, if you spend $1 keeping it up, you avoid $3 in catching up. And if you just think, it's an ounce of prevention, prevent cure kind of thing. So that's, I think you get more bang for your buck if you spend it in the blue area than if you do in the yellow area.
And it seems like we're spending both here and at Hershey more in the yellow.
Yeah, we are. But that's true.
Okay.
You can't solve all the problems by spending in the blue. I mean, there's some buildings, and part of the problem I think that we have is with the sort of block obsolescence. We have a lot of buildings that are just need really complete renovations. We saw a couple yesterday. So those buildings almost require an investment in the yellow area.
Okay.
Just another challenge we have too is some of these buildings, the space is so old, doesn't satisfy today's programs. So beyond just the maintenance issues, there's programmatic issues that some of the faculty or researchers can't do what they need to do in the space they have, even if it was updated. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think definitely importance of keep up is critical for Hershey. One of the things you can do by keeping up is extend life cycles. I mean, we see that an HVAC system is set to last 30 years, but we see lots of them that are 35 and 40 years old because people have maintained them properly. So those are the kind of things that we were talking to Hershey about to see to what extent we can not have all this come due at the same time. So we're going to turn to the Commonwealth campuses, and I'm going to turn this over to Kevin, who's led the project.
Thanks, Jim. As we go through the Commonwealth campuses, I think the main theme I'd like everyone to keep in mind is that there's really not a one-size-fits-all approach. As you look at them, and you can kind of, on the left here, we're seeing the student population, looking at student FTEs. On the right, we're seeing E&G, gross square footage. There's a wide array in both areas, in both measures of size. On the left, with the student population, you have campuses such as Erie that are close to 4,000 student FTEs. But then you also have campuses like Beaver that are around 600 or 700 FTEs. Generally, as you look through this, the campuses that have more students tend to have more space, but that's not the case for all of them, as you can see with Altoona, for example. Now, if you put these two metrics together, they're what make up that metric we've been showing you earlier, that program space, where we're looking at the academic, administrative, and science research type space per student. We're showing this for each of the campuses, and then that orange line that you're seeing in there, that's the peer average for that system comparison group that we were showing. 9 out of the 10 campuses actually have less of that program space per student, or they're more crowded. These campuses have a lot of wear and tear on the spaces that is causing maintenance need, custodial need, general operational and capital need. When we look at the age, there's also a wide array. This is arrayed in order of oldest campus to youngest campus by looking at that 25-year benchmark that we've been talking about. So for example, Abington has 96% of their space that's greater than 25 years of age. When we get over to Erie, it's closer to 28% that's greater than 25 years of age. This age profile is going to help dictate that capital strategy. I'll leave it up there for a second so you guys can take a look. Looking at the capital spending to that target line that we've been speaking about for Hershey and for UP, in each of the years, the Commonwealth campuses are falling below that target line. What that means is that your backlog is growing in each of those years by that delta between the bar and the line at the top. If we focus on that backlog, as we've been speaking about, there is an array between the campuses. The highest backlog is on the left, the lowest backlog is on the right, and this speaks to that strategy I've been talking about where there's not a one-size-fits-all. The campuses that have the higher backlog, those are the ones that need the major capital infusions to gut renovate their spaces. The campuses towards the right that have the lower backlog, they need to keep up with their spaces. Plan preventative maintenance, stewardship. It's that same concept we're talking about, the $1 to $3. Think about your car. When you get that brand new car, you're changing the oil every 3,000 to 5,000 miles, rotating your tires. It's the same with your newer buildings. Your buildings that have that lower backlog, you want to keep up with them. The buildings that fall in that middle tier there, those are the ones that require the balanced approach. They may have some older spaces that require the catch-up, but they also have some younger spaces that are going to require the keep-up. If we look at the operational snapshot for all of the first 10 campuses together, you're falling in the green in the maintenance area. You can see we have the different metrics up there, but what I really want to focus on is the output piece, that general repair score. How well the condition of the campuses and the buildings score when you're looking at the interior. When we look at custodial, you're also scoring higher than the peers in terms of that inspection piece. You're getting a lot of value on the custodial side as well. The campuses are clean. Same goes when we look at grounds. Getting a lot of value, the campuses look good. Another operational metric that we didn't focus on for Hershey and UP kind of looks at that service piece, that last bucket of our analysis. When you kind of look at the CMMS process that goes on at the campuses, what I mean by that is when you think about when there's something broken on campus, you have to submit a work order. Sometimes you can submit it into a system, sometimes you're making a phone call. It's essentially that process that helps get something fixed on your campus. When we rate and score that process for the 10 Commonwealth campuses, you can see that it is scoring below the other system groups that we're showing. The reason is a lot of these, only a handful of the campuses have an actual electronic system that they can use. So one of the opportunity that we wanted to highlight here was that if you had an electronic system, some of the smaller ones, it's going to enable them to build out a PM program, do more of that planned and preventive maintenance for some of the younger campuses. It's going to help improve customer satisfaction. You can maybe even combine that electronic system with a part-time person or a full-time person that can serve as the face of facilities and really manage the request and help to really have a customer satisfaction as a focus. It gets tough for some of the DBSs when they're the ones that have to not only take the work orders, enter in the work orders, but still handle some of the other responsibilities. So the big opportunities we wanted to highlight here were an electronic system for each campus, and then some sort of a dedicated person to oversee that process and manage that system. We also wanted to show energy consumption for the campuses, and we put them together compared to the other system groups. We did pull Alaska out for obvious climate reasons, but as a whole, the campuses are consuming less energy than this group. This is looking at an FY13 snapshot. So another positive story when we're looking at that energy consumption. Strategies on the campus side, we talked about the variation in the age profile, the number of students, the size of the campuses. That means you need a different capital approach for the different types of campuses, for the different levels of backlog, for the older campuses, for the younger campuses. Some also need additional program space to help serve their campus. Some are crowded. They may need those additional spaces to relieve that. Some of the campuses, we talked about that capital approach, they need the major infusions, while maybe some other ones need more of that keep up and some more of that preventative type capital that they can steward and maintain those buildings and make sure that they get the most bang for their buck and the buildings last as long as they should. Service process, we think that's a big opportunity. Consistent, doesn't have to be the same system for each campus, but some sort of electronic tracking system to enable them to make customer satisfaction a focus. On the energy side, continues to be a positive story. And then the last note we wanted to make here was that we actually met with Adam Dent yesterday, and we are planning the implementation of this process, collecting the information for the remaining 10 Commonwealth campuses, and then we'll have that information hopefully by late fall, kind of ready for a presentation type format. Questions on the campuses or general questions? Yes.
So why are we more energy efficient? Does it have to do with the climate? Has to do with the insulation? Does it have to do with where the thermostats are set?
Yes. Your energy consumption is going to be impacted by all of those types of pieces. From the climate standpoint, we did have a lot of Northeast type groups in there, so I don't think the climate is a big factor in the difference and the reason that you're smaller. From a complexity standpoint, we did talk about how you're a little less complex than Hershey and than UP, so you're going to consume a little bit more energy there. But I think it's also that some of the campuses, I was at one of the campuses and I asked them, like, do you guys get any type of energy is there any type of incentive to have lower energy consumption? Because it was a big focus for them. And they said, no, but we do it because it's the right thing to do. So some of those campuses, they're really making that a focus, and they want to bring down that energy consumption. I think that's what you're seeing there with that composite average.
Also, UP is a kind of a leader in energy work, and you have people here who are experts, and they go out to the campuses and work with the individual campuses. I just think there's a culture of really sustainability and making sure that energy consumption and costs are kept down. And I think you've done a good job across all of your campuses, the ones at least we've been to so far. Cultural,
I really have a question for Ford. I assume we have one centralized service system for all of University Park.
We do,
So why don't all those Commonwealth campuses use your system?
So there are 2 campuses that do use the system. We have a University Park, but the rest of them don't for a variety of reasons. It's, I guess, an area that's been decentralized. It's something I think we're aware of. The way we're going to deal with this particular recommendation is, I think, we just in the last few months implemented a new system at University Park, and it's a modern. The system we had here was like 14 years old, so we updated it to a more modern system. This initiative really cries out for a regional kind of a solution, and we're going to be talking to the campuses and working with them to see if it would be possible to, leverage the system we purchased for University Park at the campuses. They can use it. I mean, it's been it's been really a resource for the campuses to have each campus have its own system. They don't maybe have enough staff to do that, but I think if we approach it from a regional perspective, we might be able to come up with a regionalized solution.
This is probably more a question for our leadership in terms of when you have campuses like Hazleton or Beaver, which are smaller and have the highest backlog and therefore presumably the highest capital needs and spending, how do you justify putting resources there? Because allocation of resources generally follows the most populous campuses. So what do you do about that when a campus like these two needs so much more work and capital infusion, but it may not be very productive?
So maybe between Madeline and I, we could talk to that. So the 2 campuses you mentioned, we have a significant projects in the capital plan for both of those campuses. At Beaver, we're going to renovate the Michael Baker building, which is one of the oldest buildings in the system. And it's a science-related building, and that'll make a big to help their campus. At Hazleton, we're going to renovate the Costas building, which is another science-related building. Again, very expensive, has a lot of backlog. And we've already, being aware that the
from this, if I look even higher than the Commonwealth campuses, and I look across and look at University Park and look at Hershey and the Commonwealth campuses in conjunction with one another, one of my takeaways is that as much as we've talked about this new 5-year capital plan that we've just embarked on as being an era of renewal and renovation and concern about keeping our buildings up, our aging portfolio facility, I think the message is, as we think about our new planning horizon for the next 5 years, 6 to 10 years out, we're going to have to maintain that focus. We're still going to have to be investing substantially in that portfolio of facilities as they continue to age. That's not to say, again, that we won't be investing in some new buildings, but we're going to have to be, I think, very concerned over the next really 10 years to 15 years about how we're keeping up with the investment in our current portfolio of facilities.
Well, thanks everybody, and Keith for giving us the time on the agenda. I thought it was really, really beneficial, and particularly for Dr. Barrett coming on. Dr. Harrison, you have a comment?
Well, the challenge, of course, is mainly financial.
Yeah.
We have had appropriation from the Commonwealth for capital $40 million a year, with the exception of a couple of years where we've had some additional funds, for example, with the Millennium Science Complex and Children's Hospital. But that $40 million has stayed the same for, what, 14?
Since 1996.
1996, so it's now 18 years that there's been no increase. And you all know what's happened to construction costs, what's happened to general inflation and so on. So it's always a challenge to try to make up that difference, and we've done some of that with so-called tuition-supported borrowing, but that obviously has an impact on the tuition increase, you see. So it's a very delicate balancing act to keep those tuition increases down into the inflationary level when you're faced with trying to make up some of that shortfall that we have in terms of our capital needs. So I think it's an important kind of balancing act that the board needs to be very aware of as we look at our setting our tuition rates and how we're going to balance these various factors going into the future. I think the saddest thing is when you go to a campus, and I've been to a number of our peer flagship campuses that have not done a very good job of maintenance, and you can see it readily apparent. It's readily apparent as you walk on from the grounds to the buildings and everything else. And obviously, we need to keep up our very substantial stock of residence halls as well. We know we're competing very, very strongly with in almost every area with private sector residential student development. And it's difficult to compete if you have residence halls that are 50 and 60 years old in an old barrack style that simply aren't where students really want to be. So that obviously impacts room and board rates as well. And again, it's a serious challenge, and but one that I think we're going to have to work very hard to address in the coming years, so that we can continue to keep our room and board rates as low as possible, but not let our capital plan deteriorate.
Remember those chicken coops? Remember those chicken coops on this campus?
Remember, I lived.
I'm not nostalgic.